Good morning everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of our box set series called Did Paul Really Mean That? And so we come to Romans, the only one of Paul's undisputed letters that we haven't talked about yet. Some would say that it is one of the foundation stones of European and by extension Western civilization, a cornerstone of liberalism, which is kind of ironic because modern liberals would not recognize Paul's letters as the source of our modern liberal values. Many would think that Paul was a misogynist who supported the oppression of women, a racist who supported slavery, and a homophobe who condemned homosexuals. But nothing could be further from the truth, and I've explained why with regards to women and slavery in episodes 7 and 10, and you can listen to those episodes if you missed them on our website. Today in our box set, Did Paul Really Mean That? I will explore whether Paul really meant to condemn homosexuals as is commonly thought in Romans 1. It is essential in answering this question to describe the context of sexuality within Greco-Roman culture at the time of Paul, so I would suggest that this talk is not appropriate for children under the age of 16. Before we get into the detail of the text, a quick introduction to this letter, and you should know that I am planning at least one more talk based on Romans because it's such an epic letter. The letter to the Romans appears to represent a pivotal moment in Paul's life. He appears content that his work in what we call Turkey and Greece is completed, and having preached the gospel in most of the Greco-Roman cities in those regions, he's ready to move on. Here's his description in Romans 15, 23-24. But now he says that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I've been longing for many years to visit you, that is the Romans, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there. After I've enjoyed your company for a while. So he's doing his tour of the Mediterranean. And if you watched episode 11, you'll know that Paul's plans get delayed by at least 4 years in prison. And even though he does get to Rome, he's actually taken there as a guest of the Roman prison service rather than making his own way there. Anyway, Paul doesn't know any of that yet, and he writes this epic letter and asks a woman, yes, a woman, Phoebe, to represent him with the letter in Rome. If you have ever crafted an email or a letter to someone who doesn't know you, in order to persuade them to do something for you, you might be able to understand the need to do this well. And that is what Paul does in all of his letters. He's a master of using words to persuade his readers to believe him. But why did he need to convince them? Well, he wasn't the only Jewish evangelist. Paul makes reference in 2 Corinthians 11 to other super apostles, he sarcastically calls them, who are preaching about Jesus. But throughout the Roman Empire, up until AD 70, many spiritually hungry Romans were drawn to Judaism by its moral code, by its value on human life, and by its hope of messianic salvation. Julius Caesar also granted special privileges to Jews like freedom from army service and freedom from emperor worship, which only encouraged more people to convert to Judaism. Now, scholars think that whilst there were 2 million Jews in Israel during the time of Paul, there were another 4 million Jews in the rest of the Roman Empire, with up to 60,000 Jews living in Rome alone. So it should not surprise us that some of those Jews had come to trust that Jesus was their Jewish Messiah. The language that he uses here has almost invisible meaning to us, but to the Romans, Paul's introduction of himself would have sounded grandly ambassadorial, like the ambassador of another nation calling on the Romans to join his coalition of Jews and Gentiles. Come and join my gang. Well, the question would have been, why, Paul? Why should we join your Jewish gang? What's unique about your gang and your gospel? Well, Paul says in verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." So what's unique about Paul's gospel? Well, it's for both the Jew and the Gentile. In other words, every single human being. dependent not on any religious ethnicity or practice, but simply on the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Now, that was hugely controversial, and already I've showed how that drew Paul into sectarian conflict with Pharisaical Jews for 25 years who violently opposed his assertion that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. For Paul's Jewish opponents, the only way that the Gentiles could be righteous before God was by obeying the Jewish law and becoming circumcised as a Jew. I just want to add that this view was not typical of Jews following the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But Paul will elaborate further about how the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel of Jesus when he returns to the subject in chapter 3, verse 21. But first, he describes why humanity needs the gospel of Jesus by paraphrasing the typical Jewish stereotype of Greco-Roman culture. If there were two things that the Jews of Paul's era criticized the Greco-Roman culture for, it was idolatry and sexual abuse. So Paul launches into a classic Jewish critique of the Gentiles in verse 18. He says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and the wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So people are without excuse," he says. "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen," he says. Because of this, God gave them over to a shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. And in the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Verse 28, "Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, and no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but approve of those who practice them." Wow. Paul is echoing part of the standard Jewish view of the world, and he is building rapport with his Jewish readers. And let's be honest, it does not paint a nice picture, does it? But you know what he's doing? He's setting his Jewish readers up. He's conducting a sting operation against them. He produces a stereotypical Jewish argument against the Greco-Roman society, gets his Jewish audience nodding and tutting their disapproval and their agreement with him. And then, in chapter 2, he shocks his Jewish readers by turning his fire on them and says that they are no better than the Gentiles and just as much in desperate need of God's mercy. I'm going to pick this amazing argument up in episode 13, but for now, let's look at why the Jews were so critical of the Greco-Roman attitude to sex. Whilst modern streams of Judaism, with the exception of Orthodox Judaism, readily endorse homosexual relationships now, a ban on sex between two men was codified in the book of Leviticus 400 to 500 years before Jesus and became Jewish law. However, circumcision of all Jewish males was also the law. And Paul put that to one side. So perhaps something else influenced Paul when it came to sexuality. What could that have been? Well, Paul was a Roman citizen and he would have fully understood the role of sex within Greco-Roman culture. Now, I must warn you that you will not like what you hear, because as we can see from Greek and Roman literature of the time, much of what went on was abusive and brutal. What was considered acceptable in Greco-Roman culture was defined by the dominant role of men in society. Take a happily married man who was the master of his household. This man could, and often would, besides having sexual intercourse with his wife, also rape his male and female slaves and have sexual intercourse with male and female prostitutes, and neither his masculinity, his sexuality, and nor his honour would be in question at all. In Greco-Roman culture, male sexuality wasn't defined by which gender you had sex with, but whether you were dominant, active, penetrating partner, or the submissive, passive one. So long as a freeborn man was the dominant partner, little else mattered, as long as you weren't sleeping with someone else's wife. Sexuality was not tied to orientation or gender, but to action and power. To be the active, penetrating partner was to be virile and masculine. To be the passive, submissive partner was to be weak and effeminate, irrespective of gender. Now, as upsetting and as alien to our culture as that sounds, there is sadly more distressing sexual abuse that we must tell you about in order to understand Greco-Roman culture. As was common with many ancient cultures, pederasty, that is sexual abuse of boys by men, was simply part of everyday life. How distressing and how upsetting. No wonder Paul condemned this so vigorously. The irony of this horrific sexual abuse by freeborn men was that society pressured these freeborn men into sexual brutality. Greek and Roman men lived intensely public lives, and they would boast of their attacks on vulnerable young males in order to avoid the accusation that they were themselves effeminate and submissive. They would even threaten their bitter male enemies with rape to demonstrate their aggressive dominance. Not surprisingly, Greco-Roman men even had an idol of sexual aggression called Priapus. It was a scarecrow with a huge phallus, and it was often placed in fields and gardens, and it was said to police these fields and gardens with the threat of sexual assault against any intruders or thieves. Now, although Paul seems to mention lesbianism in verse 26, the lowly status of women in Greco-Roman culture meant that official written sources didn't write much about women, and certainly weren't interested in lesbianism. It was also considered less of an issue for Jews because it wasn't specifically forbidden in Jewish law. But that's not to say it didn't happen. Written spells and dream interpretations from that time show that it did. Paul's comment in verse 26 is more likely to refer to the anal rape of women by men. And this did happen often. But men valued it less than the penetration of males. They thought it was better to transform a potentially active and powerful male rival into a weak and submissive one by raping them than to actually have sex with a woman who was already considered weak and submissive by her very gender. What this all means was that same-sex activity by a freeborn adult male was practically always abusive. As an example, the Roman poet Martial uses the term cut to pieces to describe the experience of the passive partner. The passive partner was seen as used, humiliated, physically and morally degraded. Now remember, Paul grew up in Greco-Roman city of Tarsus. He may have watched attractive boys his own age being sold into slavery. Flagrant paedophiles might have pestered him and his friends on their way to school, offering friendship, tutoring, or athletic training. but his parents would have warned him that any flirting would ruin his reputation and at worst get him officially classed as a male prostitute and the loss of all his freeborn rights. As an unmarried adult male who abstained from sex, he might also have been regularly accused of being effeminate and submissive himself. Perhaps that might explain some of his more assertive and aggressive style. So Paul understood the brutal and horrifying sexual culture of the Greeks and Romans, and now we have a better idea of what it was like. How does this help us understand Paul's words in Romans 1:26-27? Let me remind you of them. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts, even though women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Males committed shameful acts with other males and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. As I have already said, when Paul says that women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones, it is unlikely that he was speaking about lesbianism. However, according to Jewish writers of the time, unnatural sex could mean any form of intercourse that didn't lead to pregnancy. So this would include oral and anal intercourse, intercourse during menstruation, use of contraception, and intercourse where one of the partners is infertile. I ask you, is it possible that Paul is condemning all forms of sex between heterosexual couples other than intercourse simply to conceive a child? What about men? Well, we should note here that scholars think the use of the English word men here is wrong, that the actual Greek means males. And that's significant because Paul's choice of Greek words indicates that he means active and passive males, which meant pederasty, which, as we've seen, was by far the most common form of male same-sex activity. So we might conclude that Paul is condemning pederasty and sex for anything other than procreation, but there is an interpretation that not only takes these considerations seriously, but also makes sense of the whole passage. Now, at this time, in Paul's era, every year there was a festival in Rome to honor the fertility idol Zibaly. This festival involved all sorts of sexual practices in a frenzied, orgiastic atmosphere. Female priestesses used phalluses to penetrate male eunuch priests, and these male eunuch priests would then penetrate each other. And if a young male spectator wanted to join the cult, rather horrifyingly, their initiation involved castrating themselves with a sword as part of the ecstatic worship during the festival. Is it possible that Paul's word picture in 26-27 reflects this festival? Was it the priestesses who exchanged natural sexual relations for an orgy involving phalluses? Was it the male priests who abandoned their natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another? Was it the due penalty for their error? Was that a reference to their brutal self-castration? Was the festival as frenzied as sources claim? Well, probably not. Such accounts owed more to rhetoric than to reality, but in Romans 1, Paul has launched a rhetorical and persuasive attack on the Gentiles' idolatry and sexual practices, and it seems very plausible that he uses the example of the Festival of Zibaly, to make his point. I think it's fair to say that Paul was pioneering a condemnation of institutional sexual abuse and a culture of sexual brutality, and he needed special language to show how uniquely evil it was. Paul was standing up for the victims of this exploitative culture, the slaves, men and women, male and women slaves, the women, the shrine prostitutes, and of course the young boys. He says that the perpetrators of this abusive and brutal sexual culture were, in verse 29, he says they were filled with every kind of wickedness, by which he means injustice, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, and no mercy. Paul condemns in the strongest possible terms the perpetrators of this abusive, exploitative, and brutal sexual culture, in the same way that we would condemn in the strongest possible terms the crimes of sex trafficking and the sexual abuse of children. He condemns it in the same way that we would. If you and I were trying to describe the people who sexually abuse children and vulnerable adults, we might well come up with a similar list of adjectives. Paul's Roman audience knew what justice was, if only through the absence of it in their lives. But they would have been surprised to hear Paul challenge the abusive, sexual institutional culture which has been embedded for centuries as an issue of justice. But many of them, the slaves, the prostitutes, the women, and the boys, would have understood the significance of Jesus Christ giving his body to save humankind. What greater contrast could there be to the Greco-Roman tradition of using a weaker body for selfish pleasure or a power trip? So, can we conclude from Romans 1 that Paul condemned the abusive, exploitative, brutal sexual culture of the Greco-Roman Empire? Absolutely. Can we conclude from Romans 1 that Paul would condemn the legal institution of homosexual marriage as we now have it? Well, that's a bigger conversation, but I'm not entirely sure that we can. But what do you think?